if he is not defeated in Ukraine. History has shown us, and the UK particularly remembers the 1930s and what you all had to go through with Hitler. Someone like Putin, his hunger will not be satiated by Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're catching up with Jim Townsend, who finished his 30 plus years in the Pentagon as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy for the 8 years of the Obama administration. For most of his career, he's worked on European and NATO policy issues, including NATO enlargement and the engagement of European allies in all post-war conflicts since the Gulf War. Jim, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time today. Let's start with the dramatic events in Russia, the plane crash that killed Yevgeny Prigozhin and his right-hand man, Dmitry Utkin. What was your reaction when you heard that news?
Well, I wasn't surprised on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was jarring to see something that you would have seen in the Godfather movie, or you would have seen in terms of some type of mafia-related killing. I mean, this is something that normally we don't see. We've been hearing, of course, about various oligarchs being pushed out of windows in Russia, and we've read about that during the Cold War days. But the sensibilities of all of us today, seeing this kind of murder take place, can be jarring. So on the one hand, I wasn't surprised. We knew Prigozhin was in for it somehow or another. But having it be done in such a way, with the number of people killed, including the crew and the pilots of that plane, it was jarring to see.
Of course, Putin has said an investigation has been launched into this, and it's not actually been confirmed exactly what happened yet. But I mean, all commentators seem to be united that this was an assassination. And that it confirms President Putin as the godfather in a kind of mafia-style state of Russia. Do you think that this strengthens his position, or is it actually a symptom of weakness?
Well, in a sense, it's kind of both. It certainly strengthens him in that it removes a competitor, or certainly someone that could cause trouble while he's trying to deal with what's happening in Ukraine. So there's an element of strength there. There's an element of strength in terms of the message being sent to others who might have something similar in mind in terms of a coup or trying to challenge Putin in one way or another. The signal sent to them was try it and you might see a similar fate. And there was a message there to the Russian people too, which is I'm a tough guy. I was not undercut by Prigozhin as much as the West wanted you to think that. I've taken care of that problem. And so there were some messages being sent to audiences. But also, had he not done this, he would have certainly been weakened if he was unable to deal with Prigozhin, if he was unable to put the scare, if you will, into oligarchs who might be wanting to challenge him. He was able to do that, and so deal with any question about weakness, which in a sense still kind of hangs over his head for allowing that to even happen earlier with Prigozhin and that coup attempt.
So are you in no doubt then that this was the work of the Kremlin?
I'm in no doubt. But what you said earlier about that it hasn't been confirmed and this type of thing is true. But from where I sit now and from what I've been hearing out of Washington and other places, I think for our audience, I think we just assumed this was done at the behest of Putin or his people. And it was to get rid of not just Prigozhin, but his whole command team. You mentioned Utkin, but also his lieutenant that does logistics. There was a number of people on board that plane. And that's a question that I think we still have to figure out. It's not just, how did this happen? Because we have a pretty good idea of that. But how was it that all of these lieutenants for Prigozhin were on the same plane at the same time? And this is with a capo, if you will, Prigozhin, who's very concerned about his own security. So how would he allow everyone to be on board that plane?
Well, the thing that one of the theories I've been hearing is that he was one of those kind of people who thought, well, this is a place to do business. And he probably was a cavalier about his own security. He thought, I need to do business. I'll do it on the plane. I'll have the closest people with me. And so what?
Could very well be overconfident, thinking that Putin wasn't going to come after him after all. Who knows? But I think there's some mysteries that still need to be examined.
It's quite interesting, though, because there are still some senior members of Wagner who weren't on that plane, notably the person known as the executive director of Wagner, Andrei Trushev. What do you think the future of Wagner will be, and how will that impact Russia's influence in places like Africa and the Middle East?
Well, it's a great question, and everyone is trying to figure that out. And I don't think we really know. I think Putin has been trying to dismantle it because it's not just Prigozhin, but all of the soldiers that he had in their arms that were loyal to him, that numbered in the thousands, that are scattered. They're either in Ukraine fighting or they're in Belarus. We don't know where they are. But if they were to come together, that would also be a threat to Putin. So I think number one, Wagner, as we know it today, is going to be dismantled. It could be reconstructed into another kind of personal military force for Putin to go off and do his bidding. But we have to also keep in mind that Wagner wasn't the only private army that the Russians seem to have. Some of the oil companies, some of the other parts of the power centers there in Russia, they also had their own private militias, if you will, that were out doing the bidding, not just of Putin, but also some of these power centers. And Putin allowed that to happen. So I think Putin probably has an array of choices to send to Africa or other places to fill in the vacuum left by Wagner. But I wouldn't be surprised to see a Wagner 2.0 come on the scene under another name and to take up a bit of the tasks that the original Wagner group was doing.
Let's talk about the war in Ukraine itself. Russia's defense ministry is reporting what would be the largest Ukrainian attack on the Crimean Peninsula. 42 drones, 9 destroyed, it says, and 33 suppressed by electronic warfare. And there was a commando raid which destroyed one of Russia's most advanced air defense systems. What kind of effect do you think these operations have?
Well, I would say there's a couple effects. One is a psychological one, and I think that's what they're really going after right now, considering that these raids are not big, but they're happening. They're able to evade Russian air defense or maritime security, as in terms of the commando raid. And it's showing the Russian people that they're actually more vulnerable than they think they are, and that Ukraine is in the fight and is taking the fight to Russia. So there's a psychological play here, both in terms of the Russian military and Putin, certainly making them feel vulnerable and embarrassing the Russian military, who seem to be struggling to deal with this. But it's also a psychological play to the Russian people, which is don't think you can sit behind the border and allow this to go on and not feel the impact yourself. I would say, too, though, that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because those kinds of attacks, if it really frightens the Russian people, they could rally around the flag, too, and become even more pro-war or pro-Putin, because suddenly they're feeling vulnerable and they are supporting the war effort. So it could be a double-edged sword. But the secondly, though, is that these attacks are hitting some pretty vital rear area installations for the Russians that they need, logistics or air defense. And so that helps on the battlefield as well. So that's something to keep in mind.
How do you think that Ukraine can build on those tactics then in its efforts to retake Crimea?
Well, I think what we're seeing, and this is how military technology changes during warfare, as you pointed out, they were jammed. A lot of those drones were jammed. So what Ukraine has got to do is, working with the West, probably come up with ways to avoid being jammed. How can Ukraine make a more effective drone that can help out both in terms of the psychological aspect of taking the war to Russia, but also in terms of battlefield use, particularly there. So building on their experience, whether it's for the maritime commando raid, whether it's use of drones and how can they evade Russian air defense, that's what they're going to have to really focus on. This war truly is becoming a war of drones. And the West is learning as much as Ukraine and how drones are being used. And more importantly, how do you defend against a drone and how do you evade the bad guys' defenses?
Yeah, and of course, drones are being used in Russia itself for attacks recently, sustained attacks on Moscow, many of which have been brought down. But do you think that Ukraine is behind those attacks?
Definitely. Ukraine is. I think Ukraine certainly is getting assistance from the West in terms of maybe intelligence, this type of thing. But Ukraine itself, their military and their military industrial complex, if you will, they're becoming the leaders, I think, in terms of drone technology and drone tactics. We're probably learning more from them than we can help them in terms of advice, because they're on the front lines learning this. So I think it's going to be interesting to see as the offensive takes off, which I think it will, how the drones will be used in an offensive manner as well. But it's definitely Ukraine behind them.
It's interesting you say that Western intelligence is helping with these drone strikes inside Russia itself, because one of the reasons why the ATACMS, the long-range distance missiles from the US, are not being supplied to Ukraine is the fear that they would be used beyond the borders of the war in Ukraine.
Right. And it is a bit, it's an interesting question and an important observation. And what I would say is that Washington is afraid of escalation, as we've heard, and so they've been slow, particularly with the F-16s and the ATACMS long-range missile. They've been slow to approve those, and yet the drones are being used, as you point out, to hit Moscow. I think for the administration, the ATACMS is a U.S. system, directly supplied by the U.S., directly linked to the U.S., used by Ukraine, and so I think the fear is that the Kremlin wakes up one morning with an ATACMS through their Onion Dome, and they point the finger at the United States and say, you've done this, now just wait for the escalation, you're going to feel this too. I think that's what the administration is worried about, is this direct link to the US. And that's why Ukraine is going to have to use these drones and the UK Storm Shadow missile, which is an excellent munition that's performing very well in Ukraine.
You're convinced that Western and US support will continue for Ukraine. Do you see that this is a no matter what situation? Because three of the candidates for the Republican nomination for next year's US elections, they've all publicly said they want to reduce support for the war in Ukraine.
Well, that's a burden we're having to carry here in the U.S. It's just gotten caught up in our politics. I would say that based on what I heard during the debates, the other candidates were very strong about supporting Ukraine, and they were the stronger candidates too. Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, particularly, were very strong, and so I think this is going to be a concern we're going to have to live with for the next year and a half as we go through our presidential election. That worry that Trump might come back, worry that another Republican might come in who is weak on Ukraine, or that the House of Representatives, where there are a lot of Republicans, or at least there's a handful of extremists, but other Republicans too, who are questioning this. This is our politics. We're going to have to worry about it. But my feeling is, at the end of the day, a lot of the rhetoric we're hearing is politically driven for political reasons. And once an election is held and we have a president, that will be supporting Ukraine, because it's also obvious that, and these people will tell you behind closed doors, it's obvious that Ukraine is fighting our fight. And it's obvious that if we don't defeat Russia and Ukraine, the U.S. is going to have to get involved, maybe with troops on the ground, as an aggressive Russia looks for another victim. So my feeling is that we're going to have to live through this uncertainty. But at the end of the day, we'll be there for Ukraine.
Maybe with troops on the ground, you say. So you do fear that if this is not resolved in Ukraine's favor, that this will fuel the ambitions of Putin to invade elsewhere, a NATO ally?
Absolutely. I think, it's there's a number of newer NATO allies that Russia has said belongs as part of Russia, as he looks back in history at some, historic Russian empire. And so, yes, that would be my worry. That would be also something that NATO is meant to deter, is that no matter how Putin might look on next steps, should he win in Ukraine, no matter what he thinks and who his victim might be, NATO has got to be able to deter that. And that's why I think at the Vilnius summit, they unveiled this military plan all along the frontier there with Russia that's pretty strong. Allies have to spend the money to provide the forces. But this is something that I think Putin needs to see, because if he is not defeated in Ukraine, history has shown us, and the UK particularly remembers the 1930s and what you all had to go through with Hitler. Someone like Putin, his hunger will not be satiated by Ukraine.
I mean, in your career, you played a critical role in NATO enlargement, and it continues to grow until Ukraine itself actually joins. How can its security be guaranteed once the fighting's actually stopped?
Well, I think what the G7 did at the Vilnius summit was important in terms of each of the G7 nations committing to long-term security for Ukraine. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean troops on the ground there, but it means a steady, predictable supply of assistance, military assistance and ammunition, aircraft, that type of thing, that will go to Ukraine to help them fight. It means keeping sanctions strong. It means keeping NATO strong too, so that as Belarus or other Russian shenanigans happening on the Polish border or the Lithuanian border, that's deterred. So NATO has a role to play in this in terms of providing that shield. But that's part of providing security for Ukraine.
Isn't it ironic that Ukraine was invaded, having given up its nuclear deterrence itself, and now an alternative is having to be found?
Well, the Budapest memorandum, where Russia and other Western nations committed to Ukraine's security, and that proved not to be the case. At least it wasn't fulfilled 100%. We're there helping Ukraine now, but not to the extent I think was expected by Ukraine, certainly coming out of the Budapest memorandum. And of course, Russia invading was tearing that agreement in half. But just on that point, in terms of nuclear weapons in Ukraine at that time, I'm not sure how that would have played out in terms of what we're seeing today. Would that have deterred Russia from invading Ukraine? Would Ukraine have kept up its nuclear capability and made it usable, i.e. something that could be used to deter the Russians? How would that have actually played out? I'm glad we don't have to see that, because if there was a nuclear exchange, all of Europe, the northern part of the globe would have to deal with the fallout, if you will, of that kind of nuclear exchange. So I'm glad there's not nuclear weapons involved in terms of Ukraine, but that means we have to keep the conventional part of Ukraine as strong as we possibly can.
We've seen this week President Putin using the BRICS summit to defend the invasion of Ukraine. How strong do you think this grouping is, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and then 4 new countries have been invited to join?
Well, it's a very interesting play here by China and Russia in the sense that we're seeing the development of another bloc. If you remember during the Cold War, maybe you weren't here around during the Cold War, but I was.
I was.
But it was like the non-aligned movement. If you remember during those days, Sweden was in there, India, others during the Cold War, representing a group neither Soviet nor West, but in the middle. And in some sense, this is becoming a separate bloc, but it's a bloc that's leaning hard towards Russia and China. And it's made up of a bloc that agrees in a lot of ways with Russia and China about the need for a new international order that's not dominated by the West. And of course, that's what Putin and Xi both say about their friendship between those two countries, frenemies, I guess you'd say, and why they're fighting in Ukraine. So this BRIC enlargement, and others are standing in line to wanting to join as well. They actually do present a very potent economic market. Saudi Arabia is in there with their oil. China certainly sells a lot to the Southern Hemisphere, the so-called global South. So this is actually a very interesting move, and it's a geopolitical one. It's not so much a military one, but it is the building of another bloc that strengthens the voice of Beijing and Moscow, saying we are representing another approach to the international community that has been for too long dominated by the West. So it's going to be a competition in hearts and minds.
Yeah, I've heard it described as being a symptom of a multipolar world. Your work has spanned the Cold War, post-Cold War political reconstruction in Europe, the reintroduction of US forces into Europe to deter Russia. I mean, is it time to rethink the way we think about the geopolitical influences that affect the stability of the world?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And it's interesting. That question is asked probably once every decade, even since the Cold War, but particularly at the end of the Cold War, as we had this opportunity to try to remake, particularly in Europe, remake that European security structure. That would include a non-communist Russia. That would include a European Union that had enlarged, NATO had enlarged, and it would be a more stable, predictable, prosperous Europe. And that's what the hope was after the end of the Cold War, into the 1990s. And that's why NATO and EU both enlarged. Russia tried for a year or two to establish some type of market economy. It did not work. And that's a whole nother broadcast. But I think,
Yeah.
I think we all gave it a shot. And we might have worked on it for too long, because even after Putin came to power, and after he made known a few years after he went to the Kremlin that he didn't like what the West was putting together for Europe, that he wanted another approach that didn't involve the United States. Russia would play a more prominent role. There was this kind of counter argument coming out of the Kremlin. It was obvious that the ideas that we had coming out of the Cold War's end wasn't going to work. And it could be that we hung on too long to a Russia that was a bit of a myth in our own minds, and in fact did not reflect reality about where Putin was. And as the years went on, after 2008, Georgia invasion, this type of thing, we got the warning signals. And still we clung to Nord Stream 2 or whatever until the second invasion of Ukraine, when the veil was absolutely ripped off. So we all tried to come up with another approach that wasn't the approach after World War II, but would build on that. And I think right now, if you talk to a lot of the nations, building on what we have created since the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War, that there is a solid foundation to make changes if the world's situation has changed. But doing it this way is not the way to go about bringing changes to the international order.
How do you think this experience should inform the way Western and allies deal with these kind of threats going forward? Because, I mean, I mentioned that you worked during the Obama administration, and famously during the war in Syria, that those red lines that Obama set were crossed on the use of chemical weapons. And that sent out a message that you can do what you want, and the West is not policing things anymore.
Well, I mean, that's an important point. That's a great point. And it shows that, at least in the U.S., every administration has its flaws, and that was one of them, is use of a red line and not backing it up. But I think there's two things. One is that situation that you mentioned, whether it was the red line situation or it was the lack of a strong response to Putin after he invaded Georgia in 2008, you look back in history, you can see mistakes made in the West that emboldened Putin. And I think those mistakes were statecraft mistakes. Those were mistakes made by decision makers who made the wrong decision based on the wrong assumptions. It's things that make up history are those mistakes. So we'll always have those. But on the other hand, I think thinking about the future and this question and the question before, thinking about where the international community needs to go, or just keeping it to Europe or the transatlantic community. How do we need to tweak and to reshape what we're doing to take into account what the BRICS might say as they get bigger and bigger? I think what China and Russia are laying out in terms of their vision is absolutely wrong. They have a third vision, and I think it's not the right one. I think the West has been doing some thought about how do we need to incorporate. At the end of the day, you have to incorporate Russia into a European structure. The Russia today, you cannot incorporate them. This is something that will have to be thought about and post-Putin. Putin will have to go away before you can think about the future. But at the same time, you don't hold on to the past with both arms and say that's the best. You hold on to what was good coming out of the international system that we built after World War II and after the end of the Cold War. You keep that good and you build on it and you modernize it. But today, with China and Russia saying what they're saying and Russia doing what it's doing, talks like that are far in the future. We're going to have to deal with Putin as he is. But there's going to come a time, maybe not my lifetime, but there's going to come a time where we're going to have to deal with a rogue Russia and figure out what do you do with that on the European continent.
Jim Townsend, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to Morgan Burdick, our producer, and to you for watching. If you'd like to support Frontline, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest updates and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. But from me, Kate Chabot, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.